Okay, looks like we're ready to go. Okay, so today we are going to talk about dividing fractions. Okay, so we've learned about multiplying fractions. Um, so today we're just going to do a little activity with dividing fractions. So before we get started, we're going to talk a little bit about some math vocab that goes along with fractions. So a couple of those words, when I write a fraction, like if I write the fraction 1/2, um, we have, we have the top number and the bottom number, but we can't call it the top number and the bottom number. They have special names. Do you remember what the special name for the top number is? Do you remember what we call that?
Divide.
No, so it's not divide, but when you see a fraction bar like this, that means we're going to divide. Okay? But the special name for the number on the top is the numerator. So I'm going to put this is the numerator. So the number on the top of the fraction is the numerator. Do you remember, after I write numerator, do you remember what the bottom number might be called? It's similar to numerator. Yeah, exactly, denominator. So we have numerator and denominator. Make sure I spell that right. Okay, so sometimes when we're talking about fractions, sometimes students say, well, the number on the top or the number on the bottom. But instead of saying the number on the top or the number on the bottom, we really want to try to say the numerator or the denominator. So those are a couple of words that we've talked about when we talked about multiplying fractions is numerator and denominator. You talked about dividing. So when you see this bar like this, that's what that means, is this fraction bar does mean division. So this means, we say it as 1/2, but you can also say it as 1 divided by 2. When you get into doing like bigger math problems, sometimes instead of writing the division problem like this, you'll see in the math problems that they'll have like maybe 6/3 times 4. And so they'll do that instead of writing 6 divided by 3 times 4. It's just a little cleaner way to write it. Okay, so other parts of fractions that are important to know. So this is called a fraction. And then do you remember what we call this? It has a special name. First of all, how do you say this number? 3 and 1/2, right? So do you remember what we call that? It's a mixed number. Okay, so this is a mixed number because it has a whole number, which is the 3, right? The 3 is the whole number, and then the fraction is 1/2. So it's a mixed number because it has a whole number and a fraction. So it's mixed up. It's not just a fraction, it's not just a whole number, it's a mix of both. So we call it a mixed number. What if I would write a number? Oh, I kind of had one already. Let's just say 12/7. Do you remember what that's called? When in the numerator, we have a number that's bigger than the number in the denominator. Do you remember what kind of fraction that's called? It's not proper. A proper fraction would be like when the smaller number is in the numerator and the bigger number is in the denominator. So what would we call it if it's not proper? Kind of like what's the opposite of proper? What do you think? It's not proper, it would be improper. Do you remember learning about improper fractions?
Not really.
Not really? Has it been a while? So this is improper fraction, okay? So improper fraction is when the number in the numerator is bigger than the number in the denominator. So usually when we have something like this happen, we have to reduce it or turn it into a mixed number. So we can turn a mixed number into an improper fraction, and we can turn an improper fraction into a mixed number. So when we turn the mixed number into an improper fraction, we're taking 3 times 2, which is 6, plus 1 is 7, and then we just leave the number in the the denominator. So this mixed number as an improper fraction is 7 over 2, or 7 halves. To turn this from an improper fraction into a mixed number, then you just divide it. 7 divided by 12. How many times can 7 go into 12? 1. So 7 times 1 is 7. And 12 minus 7? 1. So now, if this is what we would usually say is our remainder, but when we're turning it into a mixed number, we're not making it a remainder. We're putting what is our remainder as our numerator, and this as our denominator. So now we turn an improper fraction, 12/7, into a mixed number, which is 1 5/7. Okay, so those are just some math vocabulary words that have to do with fractions that we had talked about. I just kind of wanted to review those. So we also have talked about how to multiply fractions. So we're just going to do a couple of those. So if we take 1/2 times 2/3. These markers will work a little better. 1/2 times 2/3. Do you remember how we multiply these fractions? I just multiply across. Is that what we said? Yeah. So 1 times 2 is 2. And 2 times 3 is 6. So for multiplying fractions, it's pretty simple. You just, like you said, you just multiply straight across. Now we can reduce that number, and remember, reducing is bringing it down to its lowest terms. And when when we reduce, it means what number can be divided into both of these. Okay, I'm just going to grab you a multiplication chart. But it's helpful when if you're not positive. But what number can be divided into both 2 and 6?
3.
Well, we can't take 2 divided by 3, right? What about 2? Can we take 2 divided by 2 and 6 divided by 2? Yeah, so what's 2 divided by 2? How many times does 2 go into itself? Oh, you multiplied. So when you're looking at your multiplication chart to do this, remember, so you would look, you want to know how many times 2 goes into itself. So you would go here, look at the 2, 1, right? So what's 6 divided by 2?
12.
So look at, remember, look at your 2's, and then go down to your 6. Yep, and then go straight over. Yeah, so 6 divided by 2 is 3. So when we reduce this, we get 1/3. So 1/2 times 2/3, then reduced is 1/3. Okay, so let's just try another one. We'll just do 3/4 times 1/5. Okay, so can you tell me what I would do first?
3 and 1.
Okay, so 3 times 1,
3,
3. And then,
20.
very good. Awesome. So on this one, can I reduce that at all? Is there any number that can go into both 3 and 20? No, right? Because the only numbers that can go into 3 are 1 and 3. And we don't use 1 because, or, because 1 can go into every number and it would just give us the same. 20, or I'm sorry, 3 doesn't go into 20. Nothing times 3 is 20. So this number is already reduced. Okay, good job. You do good at multiplying fractions. That's not too difficult. So dividing fractions, I always think kids think, oh, it sounds scary because it's division, and most kids don't like division. I think you're one of those kids who doesn't like division.
Yeah.
Am I right? Do I remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't like division. But the good thing about dividing fractions is you actually you end up multiplying the fractions. So it actually makes it a little bit easier because in the end you're multiplying the fractions rather than having to divide any numbers. You're just multiplying numbers. So another math vocab word that's really important when we're doing dividing fractions is reciprocal. I'm not even going to spell it right. Reciprocal. Jeez. I think that's it. Close enough. Reciprocal. So have you ever heard that word reciprocal? Okay. So reciprocal basically means you're going to take this fraction and you're going to flip them. Okay? You're going to put the denominator on top and the numerator on the bottom. So when I say find the reciprocal of 1/2, all you're going to do is flip those two numbers. Okay? So it's just flipping them, and that's an important thing when we're dividing fractions, is finding the reciprocal of that number. So let's say, or no, not yet. So one trick, and actually the funny thing is, Garrett is the one who, I had forgotten about this, to help remember how to divide fractions. Little saying is to skip, flip, multiply. So this is one thing. Yes, skip, and I always forget it. Flip, multiply. So although I told you we're going to divide fractions, when you divide fractions in the end, what you really do is you multiply them. Okay, so, and then the skip is what we do. So I'm going to write out a division. I'm going to say, we're going to take 3/4 divided by 1/2. Okay, so our first step is skip. Okay, so that means the very first step, skip. We're going to skip this 3/4. We're not doing anything with it. The next thing is flip. That's that reciprocal. When I was telling you about the word reciprocal, it's flip. That means we go to this number and we flip it. So when you're dividing fractions, you always go to the last fraction and you flip it. So, and then you multiply. So that means you get rid of this division sign and you change it to a multiplication sign. So we're going to take 3/4, flip this, so it becomes 2/1, and then instead of division, we multiply. Okay? So now we can just multiply these fractions. So to me, that seems a lot less scary than thinking, how in the world do I divide? My watch is listening to me. How in the world do I divide this? But multiplication, I'm like, oh yeah, that's easy. We just multiply straight across. And then we can reduce when we're done. Or I'll show you this real quick. This is something we'll work on later. You can also cross reduce. So when you cross reduce, it just makes less work when you get the answer. So I can look this way, 3 and 1. Well, I know I can't reduce that. Nothing can go into both 3 and 1. I can't divide the same number into both of those. So those are just going to stay the same. But if I look at 4 and 2, I know that I can divide something into both of those numbers. Because first of all, they're both even. So if numbers are both even, what can I divide into them? If I have an even number, I already know that I can divide what number into it?
1.
Not 1. What's an even number? What's your first even number?
2.
2. So I know that I can divide 2 into both of these. So what's 2 divided by 2?
4.
Oh, you multiplied. Think division. How many times can 2 go into itself? 1. Very good. What's 4 divided by 2? Or what times 2 is 4? 2. So now we've reduced these already. So now we can just multiply straight across. So what's 3 times 1?
3.
3. And what is 2 times 1?
2.
2. Okay. So right now you see that we have, remember what this is called if the numerator is bigger than the denominator? Do you remember what that's called? An improper fraction, right? Okay, so we're going to reduce that by dividing 2 divided by 3. So 2 goes into 3 how many times?
1.
1. 2 times 1 is? 2. 3 minus 2 is?
1.
Okay, remember then our remainder becomes our numerator and and then this becomes our, denominator. So 3/4 divided by 1/2 is 1 1/2. Okay? Sorry, I'm thinking about something. Okay. So now what we're going to do is I am going to give you a chocolate chip cookie recipe. Okay? And we're going to look at these ingredients on these chocolate chip cookies. And then we are going to what I want to click. We are going to cut this recipe in half is what we're going to do. So if we're looking at our recipe for chocolate chip cookies, we're just going to read through it together. Our ingredients are 2 1/4 cups all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon baking soda, 1 teaspoon salt, 1/4 cup, 1 cup butter, 3/4 cup granulated sugar, 3/4 cup packed brown sugar, 1 teaspoon vanilla, 2 large eggs, 2 cups chocolate chips, and 1 cup nuts. I don't like nuts in my chocolate chip cookies, do you? Okay, so let's cross that off our recipe. I like chocolate chip cookies with just chocolate chips. I always throw in a few extra, a little more than 2 cups. Okay, so we're going to say that we are going to make this recipe, but it's just you and me who are going to eat these cookies. Usually chocolate chip cookie, sorry Bryce, you're not getting any. Usually these chocolate chip cookie recipes make, I don't know, 3 dozen cookies or so. well, between you and I, we probably could eat 3 dozen cookies, don't you think?
Yeah.
But we're not going to. We don't need to. So we want to cut it in half because, we're only going to share maybe a dozen or so. And so we want to cut this recipe in half. So cut this recipe in half, right? So I want to, if I say cut it in half, that means I'm going to divide by 1/2. Okay? So we're going to take these ingredients, the amount of these ingredients, and we're going to cut them in half. So we know how much we need to use to reduce this recipe. Okay, so let's start with the first one. How much flour do we need? 2 1/4 cups, right? Okay, well, so here we run into a problem already. When we're dividing or multiplying fractions, you can't do it with mixed numbers. We've got to turn it into an improper fraction. Okay, do you remember how to turn that? Yeah, go ahead and write it on your board. I'm sorry, because I want you to work this out with me on your board. Do you remember how we turn that into an improper fraction? I showed you pretty quick, so if you don't.
I remember.
Okay, so remember how you take your whole number times your denominator. So 2 times 4. What's 2 times 4?
8.
8. And then we add the numerator. So 8 plus 1. 9. So now, and then we keep the denominator. So now we've changed, I should have left that. We changed 2 1/4 to 9/4. So this number is the same as this number, okay? Or mixed number is same as this improper fraction. Okay, very good. So now, since we're cutting this recipe in half, we're going to divide by 2. Now, when you have just a whole number by itself and you want to look at it in fraction form, you just put a 1 underneath it. Okay? So now we have 9/4 divided by 2/1. So what are our steps to divide this fraction? What are we going to do first? You can look up here because I left the steps up here. So what's our first step we're going to do? So we're done with this. I'm just going to erase this for you. So what's our first step that we're going to do? So what do we do with this number? We skip. Then our next step is so what number do we flip? What fraction? We skip this one. So now we have to flip this one, right? If we flip it, what fraction does it become?
1
Yeah, 1/2. And then what's our last thing we're going to do?
5.
So we change the divide to multiply. Yeah. Okay. Got that written on your board?
Yeah.
Okay. So now I want you to multiply across, and then we'll see if we come up with the same answer when we multiply across. Okay, so check yours with mine. Did you get the same thing? We both got 9/8, right? Okay, now remember, this is an improper fraction, so we're going to have to change it into a mixed number. And remember, to change to a mixed number, we have to divide. 8 divided by 9. So 8 goes into 9 how many times?
1.
1. Very good. You said you didn't like division, and here you are flying right through it, Ashley. 1. 8 times 1 is 8, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so 9 minus 8 is
1.
1. So we put the 1 as our numerator and the 8 as our denominator. So now, instead of 2 1/4 cups of flour, since we've cut it in half, now we're going to need 1 1/8 cups of flour. And we can kind of check ourselves and know that this is right because we're cutting the recipe in half. So when we cut a recipe in half, we know we're going to use less amount of ingredients, right? And so if we're cutting a recipe in half, well, we can check ourselves and see if we're right because we know that 1 1/8 is smaller than 2 1/4. Okay, so what's the next two ingredients?
1 teaspoon of baking soda, 1 teaspoon salt.
Okay, 1 teaspoon baking soda, 1 teaspoon salt. So we can work this out just like we did that one, but these are kind of easy. If you cut 1 in half, what do you get? If I have 1 whole, let's look at it this way. If I have 1 whole and I cut it in half, what do I get? Okay, I have 2, but they're cut in half. So what's half of 1? I took this 1 whole and I cut it in half. So how much do I have here now? What did you tell me?
1.
I had a 1. I cut it in half. So each side is how much? We split it in 2. So each side is 1/2, right?
Yeah.
So half of 1 is not 2. Half of 1 is a half, right? So for the next two ingredients, if you didn't want to take the time to work those out, you know already that half of 1 is 1/2. Another way you can think about it is a lot of times I tell you when we're working with stuff like that, I say, think of a dollar. What's half of a dollar? And what's half of a dollar? 4 quarters. You have 2 quarters. So how much is 2 quarters? 50, right? So 50 is the same as 1/2. So anytime you have the number 1 and you cut it in half, you're going to get half. So anytime you have a whole, I'm just making sure you're alive. Okay, thank you. So anytime you have a whole and you cut it in half, you're always going to get a half. So the next ingredient then, okay, so then that would mean we'd have a 1/2 teaspoon of soda and a 1/2 teaspoon of, what was it, salt. The next ingredient is 1 cup butter, and then it says, or 2 sticks. If we had 2 sticks of butter and we're cutting that 2 sticks in half, how many sticks are we going to use? We only want half of those 2 sticks. So here's my 2 sticks of butter, but I only want to use half of them. Half of those 2 sticks. So how many sticks of butter would I use? What's half of 2? If you cut 2 in half.
1.
Yeah. So I would just need 1 stick of butter. So some of these you can do without having to divide fractions. Now let's look at the 3/4 cup sugar. And we have 2 of those. We have 3/4 cup white sugar, 3/4 cup brown sugar. This one we're gonna have to divide because it's not an easy one like 1 or 2. It's one that you're gonna have to divide on. So we're gonna take 3/4 divided by 2. And remember, if we have that whole number, what do we have to put underneath it? Huh?
A 1.
A 1, right? Okay. So tell me our steps. What are we going to do first? What are we going to do with this number?
We don't use it.
Right, we just skip it, right? What do we do with this number?
Put 1 over 2.
So you flip it. Okay, so underneath, I would just rewrite your 3/4. And then, okay, then you flip that. Very good. Now, what's our last step? What do we do with that division sign?
We divide by 1.
What's our last step? We skip, flip, and
Multiply.
so this division sign has to become
Times.
a times, right? And then we can go ahead and multiply. So 3/4 times 1/2. So you work it out on your board, and we'll see if we match up here. So what did you get?
3 over 8.
3/8, right? Okay, and that's what I got too. So now, instead of 3/4 of a cup of granulated sugar and brown sugar, we're going to need 3/8 of a cup. Okay, so our new recipe calls for 3/8, and I'm just going to shorten this out: sugar and brown sugar. Okay. Now again, the rest of the ingredients, we're at 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Okay, we can work it out by doing division. So we need 1 teaspoon divided by 2. 1 divided by 2. Okay, let's look at this. Since they're both whole numbers, we've got to put a 1 under both of them to make fractions. Okay, so what's our first step when we're going to divide these? Right, we skip that, and then we,
1 over 2.
we flip that. Very good. So go ahead and write that. And then the last step is we don't divide, we do what? Yep, so go ahead and write your multiply sign. There you go, or your times sign. Now multiply straight across. So what is your answer? 1/2 a teaspoon. So, and we reduce that 1 teaspoon of vanilla to 1/2 a teaspoon of vanilla. So remember, we talked about that up here with the soda and the salt. Anything, or 1 divided by 1/2 is always 1/2, okay? So let's look at 2 eggs. If we wanted to, if we're cutting the recipe in half, and we're only wanting to use half of the 2 eggs, how many eggs would we use? 1 egg, right? I don't know what happens. I always wonder when I'm making a recipe and I cut it in half and it calls for 3 eggs. How do you use half of 3 eggs? You know what half of 3 is? It'd be 1 1/2. So how do you use 1 1/2 eggs?
Yeah.
I know. I never know what to do in that situation. I think what I do is I just use 2 instead. I can't really remember. Or I just try to avoid situations like that. Okay, last thing. I get off track. Last thing, 2 cups semi-sweet chocolate chips. If it were me and I was really making this and I was cutting it in half, I sure wouldn't cut that in half. I put all those chocolate chips. But since we are learning to divide fractions, and talking about cutting things in half, how would I cut 2 cups of chocolate chips in half? What's half of 2? of 2 is 1. So 1 cup chocolate chips. Again, that's one that you don't really have to take the time out to divide because you just know that half of 2 is 1. Like you know that half of 1 is 1/2. So this would be our new recipe for you and I making chocolate chip cookies for just the two of us. Okay. So let's say, and we're not going to work through this, but I'm going to have you do this one on your own. Let's just say that you're just making chocolate chips just for yourself. I'm sorry, cookies just for yourself. So you don't want, you might only want a dozen cookies or 6 cookies or whatever, however many it's going to make. So you're going to cut it into a third. So how do I write the fraction 1/3? 1/3, right? So you would divide it by 3 to cut it into thirds. So let's just say the sugar. So in order to find out how much sugar you needed, you're going to do just like we did when we cut it in half, except now we're doing thirds. So we would take 3/4, change this to multiplication, and do what with this number? 1/3. So what's 3 times 1?
3.
And 4 times 3?
18.
No.
Oh.
12? 12. So you would need 3/12 of a cup of sugar if you're going to cut this recipe in thirds, okay? So that's what I'm going to have you do is you'll look at the ingredients and cut everything into thirds. And I'll have you do that on your own. So that's kind of what today we just talked about. I'll leave that up on the board so you can look at it actually. Today we just kind of talked about how to divide fractions and using that strategy of that skip, flip, multiply. So if you can remember that's going to be really helpful when you're dividing fractions. And tomorrow we will just continue on with doing some more division of fractions and then hopefully maybe a little bit more of reducing fractions. Okay, so what I want you to do now is just take this recipe and divide each of these ingredients by 3. So you can just work that out on your whiteboard, and then when you get done, I'll just check it. And if you need help, you can always ask me. Okay?
So is it